Welcome. Good morning. Thanks so much for joining us today. And welcome to this webinar on reducing poverty through economic opportunity, housing affordability, and nutrition assistance. My name is Alice Buffkin. I am the Associate Executive Director of Policy and Advocacy at Citizens Committee for Children. And I'll be moderating today's panel. For those of you who are just learning about Citizens Committee for Children, we are a 79-year-old multi-issue children's advocacy organization. We have the vision of ensuring every New York child is healthy, housed, educated, and safe. We do our work through a combination of research, advocacy, and civic engagement. And we're just so glad to be able to have this opportunity to speak to you today about how our state can advance well-being for children and families. So I think, as you all know, we are nearing the final stages of negotiations for the New York State budget. And we hope this webinar will be an opportunity for you to learn about key issues at play in relation to poverty, housing, and hunger, where we see progress in the state budget, and where we as advocates and community members can do what we can do to advance policies that support families and help them thrive. Very briefly, I'm going to introduce you to our panelists before we dive into the conversation. I'm joined today by two CCC colleagues. Bijan Kimiagar is our Associate Executive Director for Research at CCC, and Juan Diaz is a Policy Associate at Citizens Committee for Children. We'll also be hearing from two colleagues at the Community Service Society, Debbie Priya Chatterjee, who's the Senior Economist at CSS, and Jennifer Hinojosa, who's the Research and Policy Analyst at CSS. And finally, we're also joined by Emilio Tavares, who is the Director of Policy, Research, and Advocacy at Hunger Free America. Again, thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you to all of our panelists. So we are going to start off the event with a brief presentation from my colleague Bijan, who's going to walk through CCC's recently published Child and Family Wellbeing Index. This index provides a county-by-county overview of some of the key challenges facing families across the state in the domains of housing, economic security, health, and more. We believe the findings of this report will help us frame and jumpstart our conversation on the urgent actions the state should take to support and uplift families. Following that presentation, we're going to dive straight into a panel discussion of key issues at the state level, and we'll follow that with an opportunity for questions and answers. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bijan to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Alice. And I just hope that everyone can see the slides and hear me clearly. Great. It's a pleasure to be sharing this work today and in general, and to be on the panel with my fellow panelists. The work that I'm sharing with you is actually something that we've done for several years for New York City, and we recently have been moving forward identifying barriers to well-being for counties in New York State. And what we mean by well-being is that we actually look at range of publicly available data to identify counties across New York State where children and families face barriers, meaning that there's challenges that they face in accessing economic security, housing stability, health, and other aspects of well-being. We take this, we know that when families face multiple barriers to well-being, that it can affect children's development. And the information that we put together is really meant to spur action by government, by philanthropic organizations, by direct service providers, and by advocates like all of us who are New Yorkers at large to really improve child and family well-being in specific counties and statewide. All of the issues that we'll be addressing during today's panel, economic security, housing security, food security, these are part of child and family well-being that we include data on in our analysis. We look at 18 indicators of well-being to create what we call an overall index and an overall index score for the 62 counties in New York State. We group the indicators into 6 domains, looking at economic security, housing, health, education, youth, and community. All of the data analyzed for this report come from New York State agencies or the U.S. Census Bureau. For several indicators from the U.S. Census Bureau, we specifically use the American Community Survey 5-year estimates, which pulls together sample survey data from multiple years. And this approach allows us to, with reliability, understand what's happening in counties, even if they have small populations, and also to disaggregate data for households with children separately from the population at large. And importantly, this year's index makes use of data using inclusive of the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's looking at data from 2017 to 2020, which was the most recent 5-year estimates available at the time of the analysis. We take the 18 indicators and we standardize them to create the overall index. The overall index score is then ranked. We're counties from 1 to 62, and we do the same for each of the domains. What this allows us to do is to understand where barriers to well-being are across the state. And so based on the data from this year's analysis, we see that Bronx County ranks first in terms of barriers to well-being overall, meaning it has the greatest barriers to well-being relative to the other 61 counties. And Saratoga County ranks 62 in terms of barriers overall. The domain-specific rankings are also available here and in the report. But most importantly, there are opportunities for child and family well-being even in Bronx County. And families in Saratoga County also face barriers to their well-being as well. This is not an absolute issue. It's something that we need to be considering, both barriers and opportunities. We use the phrase greatest barriers to well-being or fewest barriers to well-being to describe the cumulative and compounding array of factors that systematically disadvantage or privilege children and families. And we standardize the indicators using z-scores. And what this allows us to do is that we can look at the 0 being the average, the state average, and we know which fall above or below that average, and including those who are well above or well below that average. So using these z-scores and what we call the index scores, there are 10 counties that fall above the state average, that fall into the greatest barriers overall category. And there are also 10 counties where there are the fewest barriers overall based on their average z-scores. And 42 counties are more similar than they are different to the statewide average, and those are in the lightest blue in the middle. Importantly, counties where barriers are greatest or fewest are found throughout the state. We should interpret this to mean that there is no upstate or downstate divide when it comes to the need to improve opportunities for children and families. Rather, solutions are needed that are both statewide and local to the context of counties. And we also need to be conscious that what is average or common in the state does not by default mean that things are fine. In fact, for multiple indicators, a statewide average is concerning and should alone galvanize efforts to address barriers to well-being across the state. For example, in 22 counties, more than 20% of children live in households below the federal poverty level. Based on the most recent estimates from the Census Bureau, around 746,000 children in New York State live in households with incomes below the federal poverty level, which is about 26,000 for a family of 4. Cost of living in New York State is higher than the national average, so the number of families facing material hardship is even greater than what the federal poverty level estimates might suggest. More than 1 million families in New York State had incomes below or near the federal poverty level, twice that level, so about $50,000 for a family of 4. And accounts for this material hardship is in spite of the fact that the majority of families are employed. And so it suggests that low wages are actually a huge reason for why families are facing material hardship. In 49 counties, another example, 20% or more of renter households spend at least half their income on rent alone. Unaffordable housing contributes to overcrowding rates, but overcrowded housing is not limited to densely populated counties in New York City. Most counties in New York City do have high shares of overcrowded rental housing. However, Nassau, Orange, Schuyler, Westchester also have overcrowding rates higher than the statewide average, and Rockland County has the highest overcrowding rate among renter households in the state at around 15% of renter households. Importantly, too, concerningly, over 143,000 public school students live in what's called temporary housing, meaning that it can include a shelter, emergency shelter, but also a hotel, motel, car, bus, train, public place, and also the largest share of children are living in conditions that are described as doubled up, meaning that they're living with friends or relatives because they cannot find or afford housing. Their family cannot afford housing. In counties where barriers to well-being are greatest, 2/3 of the population are people of color, inclusive of Asian, Black, Hispanic, Latino, multiracial, or Native American, categories from the US Census Bureau. Whereas in counties where barriers to well-being are fewest, the population is nearly 2/3 white. This is evidence that persistent discrimination across multiple domains of well-being are present, and that we must pay attention not just to whether the county averages are improving, but if all families, regardless of their demographics, are also benefiting from those improvements or not. I'm going to end here to say that as part of our data resource, we created 62 geographic profiles for one for each of the counties. And each contains 2 time points of data on the 18 indicators in the index, as well as several data points for county demographics. We created these knowing that they can be useful for local advocacy efforts. And we encourage you to visit our website to download the county profiles that may inform your own advocacy for children and families in New York. And on that state, I will pass the baton back to Alice and our panel of fellow advocates.
Thanks so much, Bijan. I think every time I hear you present on this data, I'm struck again by not just the severity of the issues facing families and communities throughout the state, also the importance of looking at individual communities and the intersection of all of these issues. They are all deeply connected. And I think that's part of what brings our panel together, is because they're all able to speak as experts to how deeply connected all of these issues are in the lives of families and communities throughout the state. So given sort of the data that Bijan just provided to sort of frame this conversation, I want to turn it to our panelists to talk about what you see resonant in this information, what you're seeing in terms of the work you do, in terms of the communities you speak to, and how this matches with kind of what you're seeing on the ground that's facing families and communities. So I'm going to start, Debbie, I'll turn it to you first if you want to speak to any of these particular issues.
Thanks, Alice. And thank you for having us. My name is Debbie Priya Chatterjee. Debbie, I'm a senior economist with Community Service Society. Ours is about 200-year-old organization working to improve lives of low-income New Yorkers. And the vulnerabilities that Bijan's data so perfectly captured and depicted in this stark manner is what we are trying to fight on a daily basis. So one of the tools that we use is our survey of low-income New Yorkers. It's a representative survey of New York City folks. We call it the Unheard Third survey. And we ask questions on a variety of domain, on employment, hardship, opinion polls. What do you think is holding you back? How would you rate how your aspirations, what would help, a variety of questions along all of these dimensions, healthcare, transit. And so that based off of that data, we kind of see some of the pressing issues for New Yorkers today. I have my colleague Jennifer over here, who's going to talk to you about the economic insecurity and food insecurity issues we see in the data, and I'm going to talk about housing insecurity issues that we see. What we in the latest iteration of the data, what we saw was that rent affordability is a serious problem for 57% of respondents. Interestingly, in 2021, it was a problem for 45% of the city residents. That's because of all the support that we had from federal, state, and city level as stimulus and relief, part of stimulus and relief packages coming out of the pandemic. But now that those have expired and we are kind of back to where we were, we are not back to where we are worse than where we were, because following the pandemic, the existing inequities have been worsened and deepened. And now the supports have been pulled back. So we see the rent affordability being a serious problem. More than 50% of the households said they experience rent increases, and about 1 in 3 households owe back rent, right? So housing, as probably everyone knows, continues to be a serious crisis level problem for New York City residents. Among low-income New Yorkers, about 17% faced eviction threats, and then 23% had to move in with other people just to survive. This ties in very well with your impression that housing insecurity leads to greater eviction attempts, and increases folks who are currently unhoused or having to move into shelters where they have to spend an inordinate amount of time before they can move back into permanent housing. What our survey also focuses on is the public housing component of it, and especially in New York City. And we see that public housing residents also experienced severe amounts of difficulties. As we talk more into the panel about some of the proposals, you'll see public housing continues to be deeply underfunded, and that is showing up as a major challenge in New Yorkers' lives. They about 43% said that they never had their repairs made on time. 32% said that they would like more information on the changes, and so on and so forth. Alice will probably share some of this in the emails following the panel. And one of the things that I want to end with, and I'm going to pass it on to my colleague Jennifer, is when New Yorkers were asked as to what would really help you get ahead, and overwhelmingly the answer was affordable housing and access to affordable healthcare. These were the two top priorities on New Yorkers' minds, and so that kind of like I wanted to lay it as the background context as we move further into the discussion. Jennifer.
Thank you so much. My name is Jennifer Nahosa, and I'm a research and policy analyst at CSS. So just to piggyback on what Debbie was saying, we'll look into sort of like the food hardship on her third survey. So just to give you a sense of what folks were worried about in terms of food insecurity, we found that amongst the Latinx community, about 45% reported either having to receive free food or food from relatives, skipping meals, or enduring hunger in 2022, which is very high when we compare that to the other groups. And when we look at citywide, it was only 31%. So that's a huge gap when you compare the Latinx community and citywide average rates. But when we look closely, when we look at gender, we see that Latinas or Latinx women, 52% reported food insecurity. So that's much higher when we start looking at when we look at gender. In terms of making ends meet, right? We have a section on her third survey that asks, are you worried about, do you have any rainy day savings, right? About 54% of the Latino community or Latinx community worried about making ends meet almost all or most of the time. So again, when we look at economic insecurity, we see that the Latinx community face a much higher rate of insecurity when we compare that to citywide and compared to other groups. And then one last thing is that when we looked at where are they most likely to sort of cut back, right? We see that amongst the Latinx community, they're most likely to cut back on buying school supplies. They tend to experience more income loss and receive assistance from charities in their communities. So I'll leave it at that and pass it on to our next panel list.
Thanks, Debbie. Thanks, Jennifer. I think so much of this resonates and is really sobering. And Amelia, I'll turn it to you because I know you can speak, really in depth about some of the challenges in the hunger space, particularly with some of the federal losses that were mentioned earlier.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I am the policy director for Hunger Free America, and we've been around for over 40 years fighting food insecurity nationwide. And so I think what resonates for me from Bijan's data was also the point around like wages, right? I think New York State is below the national average in poverty because our costs are higher than the national average. And so that's why it's so difficult to figure out what is the right amount of income, what's the right wage that we should set. I think affordable housing and affordable healthcare would go a long way towards reducing food insecurity. And yeah, I think there's a lot of federal actions that ended that are leaving people hanging, especially seniors. I've been making the rounds, making the point that they're particularly hard hit right now because seniors that were on SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, also known as food stamps or cupones in Español, their benefits went from $280 to like $23 starting this month. And so that's a huge jump. I'm a social worker, that's my background. So I've worked directly with a lot of different communities. And I know that they don't care who is doing what or whether it's extra or not. Like people are just going to feel the impact of that lesser budget. And I think, it's important to point out the disparities in how people experience poverty, homelessness and food insecurity by demographics. But I also want to note that it's important to highlight that upstate, there are counties that have a lot less diversity than New York City. And so there are counties that are, experiencing rural white poverty that we also have to address. So I think the solutions that we're all advocating for would really cut across and help everybody in the state. And so there's a lot that the state can do and localities as well can do to make it easier for people looking for help.
Thanks, Emilio. And I think that pulls back to the point Bijan made, which is that where we are on average is far, far, far below where we need to be across the state. So thank you all for really sort of laying the groundwork for the depth of the need. So let's pivot then to thinking about what are the solutions that advocates throughout the state have been pushing. As folks may know, the Senate and the Assembly released their one House bills next week, which essentially lay out their priorities for the fiscal year 2024 budget. We are now entering the final days, final weeks of budget negotiations where the Senate, the Assembly, the governor will be determining what programs to fund and by how much. Let's talk about how really important priorities around economic well-being, housing stability, and food security are faring in the budget negotiations. So Emilio, let's stick with you. Where are we seeing some progress in the space of food insecurity?
Absolutely. I think one of the biggest things the federal government did during the pandemic was establish free school meals for all children, regardless of immigration status or income level. Previously, people need to fill out the paperwork, whether you're, eligible for reduced or free school meals. And there's a lot of energy at the state level and nationwide to support free meals for our students. In both of the Assembly and the Senate budget proposals, they did include funding, $280 million for funding across the state to make sure schools can provide those meals. And we're very supportive. I think everybody here is very supportive of that proposal. In addition to that, I just heard this morning that USDA, the federal agency, the Department of Agriculture, just lowered the threshold of concentrated poverty necessary for the community eligibility provision. So now instead of 40% of poverty, it's down to 25%. So there's a smaller threshold to help communities meet that need. And then additionally, on the SNAP side, which is sort of my expertise, I've done SNAP applications for over 5 years. We've seen a proposed increase to the NOEP grant, which funds SNAP outreach. It stands for Nutrition Outreach and Education Program, and it funds a lot of nonprofits throughout the state to help people through the application process, whether it's online or whether it's on paper, whether it's in a different language that people need. I speak Spanish. We have a lot of staff that speak Chinese and Russian and other languages. And then also the governor proposed, increasing the minimum wage and indexing it to inflation, which I think is a critical change that would help people keep pace and prevent this kind of fight from happening every year.
Thanks, Emilio. Thank you for walking through a lot of those issues. There is definitely some movement, and we're wanting to make sure we push a lot of those items over the finish line. I want to turn to you because I think we can't talk about, again, going back to the intersection of issues about economic security and the impacts of barriers that individuals and families are facing without talking about housing. So could you talk a little bit about where we're seeing some positive signs in the budget bills and in the conversations around housing?
Absolutely. Thank you, Alice. I'm Juan Diaz, Policy and Advocate Associate for Housing and Economic Security, our Citizens Committee for Children. Yes, food insecurity and income security has a direct impact on housing instability, especially as vulnerable families are trying to recover from the aftermath of COVID-19. There were supports during the pandemic. The the eviction moratorium, enhanced rental arrears assistance. However, considering that New York State has a high rate of housing costs, living costs, there's a need for housing reform. And we did see some positive steps in both the preliminary executive budget and both House bills. On the executive budget, an effort to increase housing units, it's a first step. Additionally, we're very pleased to see that both houses included $250 million to enact and fund the first ever statewide housing voucher, the Housing Assistance Voucher Program, HAVP. What is more important, there's so many aspects about the Housing Access Voucher Program. As someone who worked in homeless prevention for many years, I saw firsthand how many families who didn't have shelter history or were not in housing court, but still would continue to struggle with paying rent, will benefit. The income maximum for HAVP will mirror Section 8. It is estimated that it will assist over 13,000 households every year, and half of the vouchers will go for families who are in shelter, when shelters capacity is at an all-time high. And the other half will go to families who are struggling with rent, who are paying over 50% of their income goes towards rent. So when families have to make decisions on food, buying clothes, a new laptop for their children, and rent, this is very difficult as a parent. I'll give you an example that I saw very often when I work in homeless prevention. A single parent making the minimum wage with 2 children, right, will bring home up under $2,000 after taxes. On a rent stabilized apartment of $1,500, this is probably only had $500 to pay to use for other resources, and this parent would not qualify for food stamps oftentimes. So it's just not the housing, but also income supports, food security that assists. So we're very excited, and we hope to see the HAVP included in the enacted budget. Also, it was a positive step to see rental assistance funding. On the Senate included $389 million for rental arrears. It is a positive step to prevent homelessness. ERAP prevented over 220,000 evictions. So it goes to tell you the importance of rental assistance, immediate rental assistance, to provide families with an opportunity to thrive, to live, especially during high inflation rates and high cost of living. So I'll take it over to income support so other colleagues can also talk about that.
Thanks, Juan. Yeah, Debbie, Jennifer, I'll turn it to you. I imagine there are a lot of threads that both Amelia and Juan have raised that you may want to pick up and speak to. So I'll turn it to you if there are other aspects you want to highlight that are making some progress in some of the state budget negotiations.
Yeah, thank you, Alice, and thanks, Emilio and Juan. Emilio, it was really good to hear about the community eligibility threshold being revised, because we all struggle with how asynchronous, how out of touch the federal poverty level as a measure it is, not capturing the extent of economic need. In the housing realm and economic security realm, some of the good things beyond what Juan and Emilio have included, I would say that the rental assistance would also wipe out 120 million in rental arrears for public housing residents, which is good. It is as much as the rental arrears are in the ERAP portal, but that is only a third of the total rental arrears. So we would need further assistance. We'll talk about that more later. One of the other good things is that the Assembly One House included a sort of a framework for right to counsel. There is a lot of research showing that having access to some sort of a counsel or a legal help really prevents eviction and homelessness in a lot of instances. So It sets up an Office of Civil Representation on the state level, and it is a good step towards right to counsel. But it limits that help and makes it accessible only to a means-tested subset of the people who might need it. So it's not a universal, it's not as broadly available. We're not going to be as broadly available as we would like it. The Assembly One House includes 50 million for eviction defense, which is good. And the Senate includes 40 million. So likely we are going to have somewhere in between those two numbers. And then additionally on good cause eviction, which is something that would make unlawful and unjustified eviction and harassment, which would deter eviction and harassment threats. It is not a done deal, but there is also gestures, including gestures that support it. The Senate supports advancing tenant protections that align with the core principles of good cause eviction without calling it as such, which is fine with us. And the Assembly said that it will continue to explore pathways to protect tenants from arbitrary and capricious rent increases and unreasonable evictions of paying tenants. So we are excited about all of this. And I'll turn to my colleague Jennifer for economic security.
So for economic security, we know that the EITC, both the state assembly expanding it to ITIN filer. So I think that's, a positive thing. We know that the EARN EITC has also been expanded. So I guess, again, that's another positive. And then lastly, we know that the New York State Empire State Child Credit expanded to the 0 to 4-year-old age group. So, these are definitely positive wins.
Thanks, Jennifer. I think so many of these, like, you mentioned the 0 to 4 just seem like basic common sense. How can we not be extending these types of supports, these types of protections? It is well past time. Many of these are issues that, those of you on this call and many throughout the state have been pushing for a very long time. So, it's positive to see that progress. Obviously, we have a lot of work to do in these, final weeks/days. And I think you all already started to get a little bit into some of the areas where maybe we haven't seen movement in the way we want. So I'm going to pivot a little bit to, are there aspects of the priority areas that we really want to see in the adopted budget where you were hoping to see more progress this year, that you're really going to be looking ahead to see and push for going forward? And Debbie and Jennifer, let's stick with you guys.
Well, on my end, I think with the EITC, it hasn't been expanded to youth workers, and I think that's super important, especially with the economic climate that a lot of youth workers face here in New York City. So I think that's one of the negatives. Hopefully, that could progress to something that can be expanded to.
And then the good news of expanding the Empire State Child Care Credit to 0 to 4, the young children, one thing that was a little disappointing was that it still does not include full refundability, which means that the households that are in abject poverty or have really low incomes will still not be eligible for that. Even if this were to go through, the executive budget did not include an expansion of that. So that needs to be seen how it is hashed out between the negotiations. One more thing that is a bit disappointing for many of us gathered here was that neither of the bills neither of the One House budgets included any expansion in cash assistance needs. That has, these levels are not indexed to inflation. They are not indexed to anything. They have been the same for decades now. And the past year or year and a half of soaring inflation have eroded any of the purchasing power that these assistance can actually bring in. It is really starkly low. For example, let me find my notes here. The family of 3 with no other income beyond cash assistance is granted only $389 a month to meet their basic needs, including money for utilities. So, and a single person is expected to survive on $183 per month, or it's like $6 a day. So as we go about our days, let's just think, what does $6 a day enable us to enable us to buy, enable us to purchase. So so that was a little bit of a disappointment. There are individual bills in effect that try to achieve those. So our last push might be to have some of these bills passed outside of the budget, but because they have a fiscal impact, we don't know how likely it would be. So these are some of the disappointments in the economic security area. Back to you, Alice.
Thanks, Debbie. And I think we'll have some time near the end of the panel just to talk about some of these opportunities kind of moving forward in the legislative session too. So thanks for flagging those. Juan, I'll turn it to you in terms of sort of spaces within housing. Where are we seeing, or where were we hoping to see more advances kind of in the conversations happening between the three chambers?
Oh, yes, Alice, absolutely. As I mentioned, HAVP funding, it's very limited. It's a first step, but it would only cover some portion of the applications when there are still 179,000 pending applications. And with the expiration of the eviction moratorium, we'll see more and more housing court cases, more families evicted by marshals. And what does this impact is the family's inability to sign a new lease, families' constant fear, and also if a family has a pending HAVP application, they will not be able to access what's called a one-shot deal. Basically, it's a one-time rental assistance from the Human Resources Administration in New York, because if there's a pending application, HRA will not assist this family. So they're really in a limbo in providing more assistance. At least the similar amount, $800 million that was included in last year's budget, will provide much needed assistance, not just for NYCHA residents, but for residents throughout the state. Additionally, we would like to see not only the authorization, but funding included to support undocumented families and having access to the CFEPS voucher. Currently, families are eligible, mixed status families, with at least one person with a social security number. However, this family is only eligible for one person rent maximum. So families are forced to move into studios, one-bedroom apartment, and this I saw firsthand, which only creates, continues the cycle of overcrowding, continuous cycle of many need food and and income insecurity for undocumented families. So there's a need to include these families who contribute to the economy in the state. And also, we were disappointed not to see, as Debbie mentioned, with the cash assistance, something that is attached with cash assistance, which is the shelter allowance. The shelter allowance is a grant provided for families and individuals who receive cash assistance. The shelter allowance has not been enhanced to reflect the ever-growing housing market prices in the state in over 2 decades. So it goes to tell you the need to increase this funding. For instance, a family of 3 in New York City receives $400 in shelter allowance, and a family in Albany receives $309. When rents are over $1,500, families are continuously in struggles and back in rent, in housing court, and in danger of eviction. So we hope to, we're happy to see that some HAVP funding, HAVP funding, but we'll continue to support these other 2 bills, the CFEPS for undocumented families and also shelter allowance in the legislative area.
Thanks, Juan. Thanks for really sort of drawing attention to what it means to be trying to make it with such really ridiculous amounts of support. So, Amelia, I'll turn it to you to speak to some of the kind of where we want to see more in terms of access to nutrition supports and anti-hunger programs.
Yeah, and even to connect to some of the programs that we're already talking about, I think the thing that is sort of budget related, but also could be done legislatively, is that the application process for a lot of these things are very burdensome on clients, whether it's money, traveling to different offices, or the time it takes to travel to different offices, to go to different places, or fill out different paperwork, print different documents for applications that are all basically asking for the same thing. So there are a couple of bills going on at the state level to simplify the application process and integrate that stuff. I think it's crazy that, you know, the eligibility for, let's say, housing assistance and SNAP are basically the same, right? Like household size, immigration status, income. And so why is it on the client to go to different places? Like, why are the agencies not talking to each other and sharing information on, like data matching is what we call it? Like, how come the agencies aren't data matching? It's like, oh, you applied for housing assistance, or you just entered the shelter system, you're eligible for all these things. I don't think it should be on the client to then go ahead and go, you know, talk to 4 or 5 different caseworkers. You know, from my time being a social worker, a lot of people, you know, I would do as much as I could on my own, but ultimately I would have to, you know, give people 3 or 4 different referrals. And I noticed that every additional referral led to more drop off because people just felt, you know, the emotional burden of having to tell their story over and over to different people that may not be as empathetic as a social worker. So I would like to see more of that being spoken about at the state level. Like, how can we make it easier for people who are already struggling to apply for multiple things at once? And then also there are, you know, programs that are, you know, we have a lot of undocumented immigrants in this state that pay taxes. You know, immigrants pay taxes, they're taxpayers. And that's what, you know, these programs are what our taxes go towards. And so I think there needs to be some state level programs that are available to everybody, regardless of immigration status, particularly food assistance. I think food budgets are one thing that people can cut, right? Like, okay, I have to pay my rent. My landlord's not going to take half the rent, but your food, you can sort of like shift around. So I think we need to do more to make sure people have enough to pay their bills and eat at the same time.
Thank you, Emilio. Thank you for highlighting that. And also just, I think, you know, folks are including this in the comments too, just the sheer barriers that are presented that make things even harder to access. Thank you for highlighting that and how that's an issue that doesn't have to be addressed through budget. That can be something that's addressed through administrative changes, legislative changes, things like that. So, you know, we're nearing sort of the hour. So I want to sort of pull it together by thinking through what is sort of next for advocacy in these areas that everyone's been raising. Because we have, you know, sort of 2 tracks. We have none of this is for sure in the budget. You know, even the good things we're highlighting, we still have to fight to try to get, you know, these things in there. So sort of what's next for your focus and trying to get these key issues that we focused on over the finish line, and then looking further ahead, whether or not these issues do get in the budget, what are some of the areas that we can look through legislation, or as folks have mentioned, administrative advocacy, places that we want to be going as we sort of start planning out the next year of advocacy. So Juan, I'll start with you.
Yes, Alice. On the housing side, definitely, you know, we'll continue to support Senators Kavanaugh and Assembly members' bill on the shelter allowance, Senate Bill 2982, and Assembly Bill A5543. It's hugely important to continue to support for the shelter allowance enhancement. Additionally, Senate Bill 1631 to expand CDFAB's eligibility and include funding is hugely important. We will also continue to support efforts to increase affordable housing throughout the state. It's hugely important to provide families throughout the state access to affordable housing. We understand there's some there's always going to be some barriers to that, but I believe that working together in comprehensive packages, including regulations in New York City for basement legalization and office space are positive steps. And as Emilio mentioned earlier, ensuring that the administrative process of housing and other programs like SNAP, cash assistance are streamlined. There's too much paperwork that only confuse families in a time where time is of essence. We'll continue to support bills that improve the administration and the provision of housing assistance.
Thank you, Juan. And Amelia, I don't know if you want to build on that too, in terms of, I know there's also a lot of great innovations in other states that New York can also look to. I don't know if there's some additional areas you want to flag for sort of both this session, but also looking forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I've worked very closely with Assemblymember Jessica Gonzalez Rojas on a number of anti-hunger initiatives, especially the Universal School Meals piece and the increased NOAP funding. I think I mentioned 280 million for the school meals and then 5.22 million for the NOAP outreach. We hope that'll make it into the final budget. And then I think looking ahead, the legislative session is still coming. So like you mentioned, Alice, there are like legislative administrative changes that could be made so that agencies speak more to each other and do the data matching. I see a lot of agreement in the chat. It's a no-brainer for sure, especially because the governor has already said she wants to make simpler the programs for childcare and families. I think that is great. And I think that we need to do more for also seniors because we know that, that's the population that's increasing most across the country because birth rates are going down. And so I think anything that can help seniors more easily apply for these programs is critical. So I think looking at the legislative session and then also next year, I would love to see funding and more like of those legislative changes. Jessica Gonzalez Rojas is introducing a bill to put funding behind making it easier for the agencies to talk to each other. There are some sort of like administrative policy barriers for why, we do want to keep the data safe. So I think that's critical. We don't want people to be afraid that their information is going to be used for nefarious purposes. And I think in terms of the point of learning from other states, California has recently included immigrants, regardless of immigration status, who are also 55 and over into their food assistance program that they call CalFresh. So it's state-funded food assistance for everybody, and that's something I would love to see replicated in New York State. So I will be working with the Assembly on introducing a bill to push for that. Ultimately, I think we also need to address how inadequate the benefit levels for SNAP are at the bottom, particularly for seniors, again, because they get Social Security. And again, from my own casework, it was so disheartening to just see seniors sort of go through the process, jump through the hoops to get food assistance, and then ultimately end up with $23. That's sort of the minimum SNAP benefit. And that's an increase from pre-pandemic, which was $16. So it's still abysmal. And what New Jersey actually did very recently was add state funds to make the floor of their program $50. So they're adding that $22 extra to bring the floor of SNAP to $50. And so I think that's a great thing. I think New York could probably even raise that further up. So I think those are a few of the things I'm looking to fight for in the coming year.
Thank you, Amelia. Those are some really excellent areas that New York really should try to be at the lead of. Thank you for sharing that. Debbie and Jennifer, are there areas you want to flag and highlight for sort of focus now and also looking ahead?
One of the things that we already have mentioned, and it seems to, but it seems to be really important both this year and going forward, would be a fight to improve the cash assistance levels, that both at with the shelter and the non-shelter components, shelter components that Juan mentioned, which are way below the fair market rents, and similarly for the cash assistance level. So that's going to be one of our priorities. We would also, there are two populations that receive earned income tax credit, which is insufficient. For example, like youth workers, and which we had hoped to see this year. It had been included in the Assembly budget last year, so we were kind of hopeful. It didn't happen, so we'll fight for it, and also increase the EITC amount as received by childless adult workers. This is one of the population that is pushed into poverty because they receive EITC because post-tax. So that's not something that we want to see happen. And very quickly touching on something that one mentioned, that we want to see more affordable housing. We would, the executive budget included a version of it, but not perfect, obviously, but it was not included in the one house budgets. So we are going to be going to advocate for build more housing, but build more affordable housing. And we feel that we need both the carrot and the stick approach. We cannot just do it with incentives when you do it, and then no penalization for when you don't do it. So that's because that's the hard reality as we see it. So these are going to be some of our priorities going forward.
And just to add on, I think Juan mentioned about the City FEPs. We do have our City FEPs campaign that we're working on as well, along with our partners. So I share that link in the chat box. And also providing research, from our UHT survey results. So we're hoping to push out our food insecurity and economic precarity research briefs as well.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks for flagging that. I think that actually ties into what I was going to say is there's just a wealth of resources being shared in the chat, both from our teams, but also lots of folks who are participating are just sharing really compelling data, information about these issues. So I just want to thank everyone who's participating in that. I think a couple times, and we'll do it again, we've shared a take action that CCC has flagging some of these areas that we really need to push for in this to get them in the adopted budget this year. So I just want to open it up if folks have other, if they have other steps they want to push those who are listening to take in this time to make sure that we can try to promote those issues that everyone has been speaking to today. If there are take actions, if there are activities you'd like to flag, and then also if there's any kind of closing remarks you want to make, this is a space for that too. So I'll just open it up if anyone wants to jump in. And then we'll have some period for questions. So if people have those and you want to start popping them in the chat, feel free. Juan, I'll call on you first since
thank you. Yes,
I'll use my CCC privilege.
Thank you. Yes, being informed is so important to debunk misinformation on income, housing, and poverty. There's been decades of disinvestment that have led into high levels of poverty, especially among children who are the future. And as I mentioned earlier, I saw firsthand how there's this cycle of poverty over and over, and I saw families coming back for assistance because lack of income support, unemployment benefits, cash assistance, food. So it's important for members of the community to become involved, to complete e-actions, to write to their state and city local elected officials, and to also that's the biggest contribution that they can make to improve the lives of many, and support overall society's well-being.
Thanks, Juan.
And also just to piggyback on Juan, like making all of this available, like all this information in Spanish and other languages as well, so that folks in New York City are aware of these issues and perhaps, probably, come up with solutions and things of that nature.
I think there's also a lot of great opportunities to volunteer. So I'm putting in the chat our website for that. We have tons of opportunities throughout the state, throughout the country, because I think it's not just about, giving food to people one bag at a time. I think a lot of this advocacy, a lot of this outreach and information, a lot of people just don't know that these programs exist, especially immigrants that are coming from countries that don't have these kinds of social services. I'm from the Dominican Republic, and when I talk to my mom about these kinds of things, she's like, "Oh, but government's corrupt, like they don't do anything." And I'm like, there's a lot that they do. So I think just sharing with your networks and volunteering whatever time you can. If you have professional skills, use them to further a lot of these things. And then also just connect with your state legislature members, your state senate, your state assembly, people that have a stake and the power to voice their opinions on these issues. I think a lot of the issues we're talking about are getting a lot of support. So you as constituents have the power to push us over the line. So thank you.
Just to add on Nili's point and on outreach and knowledge, that I noticed, and there's been research about how outreach leads to those in need finding more resources. after-school programs, ESL courses, mental health. Just by going, and getting assistance on food stamps, cash assistance, they become more informed and involved in their own lives. So it's very important to increase outreach efforts and knowledge in the community.
Thanks, Juan. Bijan, I know you made a comment in the chat about the report. I don't know if there's anything you want to say verbally. I know we're waiting for folks. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand. But Bijan, I don't know if you want to say a few words as we wait.
I guess I'll just reiterate, thanks for Rimsha Khan, who's our colleague, who's also joining us this morning, for the help with putting together the report. And all the remarks from the panelists this morning, I learned so much. Thank you so much for your remarks and information this morning.
And while we wait for questions, just want to reiterate to the folks in the room that the deeply intersectional nature of all of these problems. We are artificially, we are siloed ourselves into picking up different topics. But as you might have realized, both during this webinar and also as you go about your advocacy efforts, how deeply connected these are. When we talk about minimum wage, we have to talk about raising the wages for childcare workers. We have to talk about raising wage for home care workers, right? And that is, and then we have to fight back the opposition from the industry saying that, well, you cannot expect someone to be paid that high and still for the industry to sustain. But then we find out that there are so many leakages, there's so many intermediaries that siphon off millions of dollars and hundreds of millions in profits. So just being aware of all these nuances as we work through to lobby for our asks, to get our priorities done. It has been both exhausting, but also interesting and deeply rewarding when we can get some really good policy in action. And thank you for all of the work that all of you will do. And you have taken time to attend to this. That shows your commitment to these issues anyway. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Debbie. I think that was such a great note to sort of end on and recognize both the intersecting pieces of this, but also like the hope of the work that's happening by so many people across the state and the incredible advocacy, both of individuals and communities and at the state level. So thank you to you all. I'm going to take one more moment to just prompt folks in case there are any questions from the audience. Looks like we have one question. Okay, so I'm going to read this out loud and let folks who feel like can respond to that. So, how much of the successes of all these proposals depend on figuring out how to maintain adequate staffing in state and city agencies and contracting nonprofit partners? Are there any studies on what barriers need to be removed and what salaries need to be in order to be able to hire into these critical positions? It's a great question because we haven't touched a ton on workforce, but that's obviously essential. When we see cuts at the city or the state level, that impacts the ability to do all of the things that we're talking about. So I'll just open it up if anybody would like to respond to that question.
I could kick us off because I have a lot of thoughts on this, and this is a great question. Thank you, because specifically in New York City, HRA, Human Resources Administration, is the agency that supports SNAP and a variety of other programs like the Fair Fares, Metro Cards, and such. And they are going through a staffing shortage. There's something like 500 empty positions that they have, and SNAP delays like in processing applications is at the months mark. It's taking months for people to get their benefits after they apply when it's legally supposed to be 30 days. And then I think part of the reason I'm advocating so hard for the NOEP grant in particular is because a lot of us in the nonprofit sector are doing this great work to help people and do outreach, but there isn't a lot of funding coming from the government for those local organizations, right? There's community-based organizations throughout the state that are not able to, that would like to provide SNAP outreach, but just are not able to. I think in terms of like, is there a pay scale or are there salary requirements? I don't think there is consensus on that, unfortunately. But I think in general, all nonprofit contracts and all nonprofit salaries need to be increased. I think part of the staffing shortages is that the jobs are not paying enough. Like an entry-level position at HRA is paying like a little bit under $40,000, which is not that far above the poverty line. And so I think we need to, the poverty line we know is inadequate at measuring hunger and poverty accurately. So I think we need a reassessment of how much these jobs are worth.
Emilio, great points. Anybody want to add to that, Juan?
Yes. As someone who works in social services, it's not just the pay, but also improving the amount of paperwork, administrative. Only delays creates more burnout. It creates more caseloads for case managers, for supervisors at HRA, and for housing, for instance. Long delays in responses make landlords pull back from deals, right? When there's already an agreement, a lease for a family to move out, these only delays. So short staffing, too much paperwork. We need to modernize the system. We'll make it more streamlined so that it both helps nonprofit workforce and also government agencies to make their work much easier and assist families in a much faster way.
Thank you, Juan. I see that we had someone unmute themselves. Steve, I don't know if you were trying to ask a question of the panel. Maybe not. It may have been inadvertent. I think I don't see any other questions in the chat. So I think, barring any final questions, I think we can wrap it up. I just want to really express my appreciation for all of you, not just for your participation in this panel, but for all the work that you do. And thank you everyone in the chat. It's been a really engaged chat, both in terms of sharing information and engaging. So we appreciate that, and just urge you to continue acting. There are take action opportunities. There are, as everyone mentioned, ways to get involved both locally and at the state level. So really thank you for your interest, and we'll definitely be sending out a follow-up email with a recording of this webinar with some of the links that were shared, so that you'll have an opportunity to follow up that, and feel free to share that widely with folks who maybe couldn't attend live. So with that, I'll say thank you and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you all. Have a good week.
Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.